Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you again so much. We really, really appreciate you joining us here with Pro Bono ASL. So go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what are your hobbies. Tell us who you are.
Sure. First, I want to say thank you. It's an honor to be here to talk with you today. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Romduol. I myself am Cambodian. I actually have three different nationalities: Cambodian, Chinese, and Indian. But most of the culture that I was raised with was Cambodian. I also identify as queer, identify as gender fluid, and pansexual. I'm deaf. My family is hearing, except I have one sister who is also deaf.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Um, Actually, recently, my sister and I found that in my dad's lineage, it seems that we do have some
Oh,
genetics that
interesting.
have skipped a few generations, but genetics that cause deafness. So it's not just me and my sister. There are some of our ancestors that were deaf, but my sister and I were the first deaf generation here in the
Oh,
US.
okay. Oh, wow.
Right, because my parents moved here. Well, they moved as refugees
Okay,
from Cambodia.
okay.
It was a time after World War II. As World War II was finishing, Khmer Rouge, that war that was happening in Cambodia, my parents were
Um,
slaves and they finally were released there. They went to Vietnam and then they moved here.
okay,
Yeah, and that's
wow.
how it all went.
And where are you right now?
We've been here ever since. And right now I'm in Washington. Well, I'm on vacation in
Oh, nice.
Washington, but I'm from California.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
I was
cool.
born and raised in California all the way.
Southern or northern?
I'm from Northern California.
Okay, northern. Got it.
I was born in Sacramento.
Oh,
I grew up in the Bay Area and then moved back to Sacramento.
got it. Got it. Wow, how cool. Wow, that's a lot of traveling. That's beautiful. What a
Yeah,
amazing experience.
thank you.
Amazing. So, and again, we're honored to have you here with us. So, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, I guess moving on to the second question about your identity, you mentioned gender fluid, something that you identify as. So it's interesting now. We have more awareness about queer identities and the diversities there.
Hmm.
And how would you say that you would like to expand upon on how your identity looks like for you? And it's interesting that we see different dialogues about
Right.
queer and the science for that, and there's some debate about
Yeah.
that. So it's interesting to see that. So I'm wondering, and especially because yourself as a DI. Deaf interpreter, so what your experience is in managing that and handling
Hmm.
that, and how you create access to the community and for
Yeah,
that identity
yeah, there's
itself.
different signs.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Well, really, for gender fluid, I typically sign like this because really that's based on my personal preference. That matches me
Right.
as a person, my personality. I'm not saying that it matches all people who identify as gender fluid. Gender fluid means diversity and fluidity. It's based on my feeling. And it changes depending on my gender identity. If I feel like male, female, neutral, both, it just really depends. And as for my pronouns, those change as well. And people will sometimes ask me, oh, I just want to clarify, what are your pronouns? I usually tell them they, them, just to play it safe without, I don't want people to feel like they're misgendering me or using the
Right.
wrong pronouns.
Right.
And recently, I think last year, finally, luckily in California, there was a law that was passed and I get approved for my
Oh,
ID
that's right.
to have an X next to gender. And I finally got that worked out and now it
Oh,
says gender
wonderful.
X. And I was just thrilled because I feel like that
Yeah.
matches me perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I felt really good about that. And gender fluid, how I first found out about it, I mean, the deaf community has limited access to
Right.
information.
Right.
And the same
Right.
with the hearing community. There's limited access to mental health and
I
health
totally agree.
resources, and sexual education is usually hetero. It doesn't include
Yes.
LGBTQIA, and
Yes.
so in that sense, it's limited. But as a deaf person, how do I access that? It's either in English or People will speak if I try to
Right,
watch videos on
right.
YouTube and the captions are really lousy. They have automatic captions
That's
and
terrible.
they are never perfect. And so I did my own research, and this was a while ago. You remember
I still have
Tumblr?
one. I still have one.
Right, same. I still have it. But it was a good tool. It was a good tool for me to learn,
Right.
different concepts, different vocabulary. And when I did more research, I delved in and I finally found something that I felt matched me. Gender fluid, I found out about that a few years ago. It's pretty
Yeah.
recent for
Wow.
me still.
Wow.
But I grew up always feeling like I wasn't understanding, I didn't feel right in my body. And when I found this term, I felt like it matched me perfectly, and it's been that way ever since. And I mentioned I was feeling uneasy, and it wasn't until I learned more about gender
Mm-hmm.
fluid that I learned more about non binary. And it seemed that this
Okay.
discussion of non binary and trans was a topic that I wanted to learn more about, and I started processing to a point where I felt I think I identify as non binary and trans because of gender fluidity.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, this conversation continues to happen, but I want to honor older people that are deaf that have fought
Right.
for specifically queer people,
Right. Yes.
deaf centered resources. I feel the discussion of the sign for queer doesn't really match.
Yes.
We have to
Yes.
continue learning, and I think it's important that we look at all these different resources, and it's important for the deaf LGBT community to discuss what our sign will be.
Well, I 1000% agree with that. It's so interesting how identity can show up later in life, how we can, we're blessed to find something that matches
Yes,
us.
yes.
And like with myself, I identify as Two Spirit, and because of my native heritage. But I didn't grow up on a reservation. I didn't grow up with these experiences that are registered with Native American, and so it's sometimes conflicting to say that I'm Two Spirit because I didn't have that experience. So sometimes I go with gender queer because, again, that experience of growing up and feeling
Mm-hmm.
code switching between masculine and feminine, it depended on the day, it depends on the time, it depends,
Right?
what shows up in my spiritual
Yes,
sense
that
and how I
exactly.
want to express myself. Yeah, yeah. So I totally understand that experience when when we're going through life and then we find this term, this identity that beautifully matches who I am and expresses that. And so I completely understand that experience. So thank you so much for sharing that. Really,
Of
really
course, of
appreciate
course.
that.
Yeah, of course, no problem.
Mm,
Yeah, and I was just listening to you and you were discussing culture, and I think, yes, I totally get it because I'm first generation and I feel, a little bit different. My
yes.
siblings, I have four siblings, and for example, one of my brothers really has strong traditional ties to our culture.
Okay.
He has a lot of exposure from our parents, and I've
Mm-hmm.
always felt like I am cross cultures. I feel like I was born here in
Right.
America,
Yeah.
and the culture is different than the culture in Cambodia. The
Yes.
language is different, and there's so many different things on top of deaf culture.
Right.
So,
Right. So
right,
many
exactly
layers.
that. There's different layers. And my sister, who is deaf, she's still very understanding and knowledgeable, and she's very much a bookworm, and she tries to acquire as much understanding about culture that we otherwise don't really have access to.
Mm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's something I've been struggling with myself. Like, I grew up very stubborn, like a rock, and I see culture all around me, and American culture has kind of a negative view of other cultures, and so I started to resist my own culture.
Mm,
Really
yeah.
from the start and growing up, and it wasn't until I was older that I finally found it's fine to embrace both cultures. I can embrace my Cambodian culture. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing negative about it.
Right.
It's fine.
Right.
And so I did recognize that I did have a struggle growing up.
Wow, wow. That's so interesting. Just that concept about, being first generation and coming here and having that experience, and how there's so many other, indigenous people that I've had conversations with about being disconnected, having dialogue about being disconnected from our ancestors. And,
Right.
it's,
Right.
we don't move anywhere, but with colonialism, how that has impacted and
Mm-hmm.
demolished so much of that connection and impacted different individuals, and still having that experience, being first generation, and it's just so interesting. I never
Yeah.
thought about that parallel of being able to find your culture and how you're able to navigate that space. So that's thank you for sharing that. Thank you.
Of course, of course. It's just a unique experience. I think it's important to recognize that the culture is
Yes.
strong. It's a
Yes.
dominant culture in America.
Right. Right. I completely agree. Thank you. So the next question. So now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and talking about being a DI. Um, why did you decide to become a deaf interpreter? What inspired you, or what moment did you experience that was part of that journey in becoming a DI?
Really, I never thought of myself as becoming a deaf interpreter. I never thought that a DI would be part of my career goals.
Oh,
It happened one day. I found through conversation, somebody mentioned DI, and I said, "Hey, what is a DI?" And so we were talking about it, and they said, "Oh, I can ask a DI if you want." And I said, "Sure." And there's a class, and you can be in that class. And I was like, "Oh, so that sounds like something that would really match me. It's about processing and translating, translating and interpreting information and figuring out what it really means and processing that information and adjusting to different consumers." And I've been
wow.
doing that my whole life anyways. I'm just used to it. Plus, I remember looking back, growing up. First, I was part of a mainstream program, and then I went to school for the deaf. So I was half in mainstream and half at a school for the deaf. And after I finished my time at the school for the deaf, I went back to mainstream and
Oh,
graduated in about
wow.
1 or 2 years. And then in college, I noticed that interpreters were struggling with understanding me. They weren't used to having to adjust to different
Ah,
signers. And so, when I met a deaf interpreter, I didn't have to adjust to them. And so from there, the DI actually asked me, "Hey, what did you ever think about becoming a DI?" And I thought, well, okay, well, I'll go ahead and take a class. And I really did just fall in love with it. And I have been interpreting now for 2 years, yeah,
wow.
as a deaf
Wow.
interpreter.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
And that experience of having to code switch, how that shows up, in different
Mm-hmm.
avenues of life, how we have to navigate that, how we have to use it as a tool to benefit us, how can we use that in different approaches? So
Right.
that's amazing. That's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So the next question, so with deaf interpreting, especially now, with your experience and that journey, why do you think it's important that we have deaf interpreters? For a lot of hearing people, they're perplexed by why there's a deaf interpreter. So why do you think it's important and a necessity to have deaf interpreters?
Well, I think it is really important to have a DI. You don't always have to have a DI in every situation,
Right,
but it's
right,
good to provide deaf people with different options and let them know that they can have options. They can have a DI. Plus, at the same time, recognizing that working with a hearing interpreter as a team, I mean, you have your skills in your field and I have my skills, and we're both bringing something to
right,
the table to make this successful.
right,
You can't
right,
just work on your own, you have to work as a team. There are several skills
right,
that are involved, and it doesn't matter if you're working with another deaf interpreter, if you're working with a hearing interpreter, you have to work together. Plus, we each have our specific expertise in linguistics or culture, and we include our experiences. Like, for example, I've seen different hearing interpreters do work while they're working, and then when they're not working, they're, "Oh, I'm off, I'm off." I
yes,
noticed the difference between those two approaches with interaction is different. I've noticed that they're missing experience. They're
right,
not understanding the specific context. Or, for example, I remember recently I was working with a deaf person and we were having a good conversation. We had a whiteboard, and he said, "Well, that means we don't need the interpreter." And the interpreter was like, "I don't understand what you mean." And they were arguing for a few minutes. And I told the hearing interpreter, we don't need the hearing interpreter at this moment because he has a board and he could just write for himself.
right.
And the hearing interpreter was like, "Oh," and finally made the connection. And so
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
other deaf person and I have that connection. We have that understanding. Even it could be slight through facial expressions or body language. There's intention behind everything that's said or every expression that's made. And sometimes hearing interpreters will lose that
Right.
if they
Right.
miss a certain facial expression or a sign that looks like another sign and they didn't understand exactly what the deaf person was saying. Or it could happen if a hearing interpreter, sees a home sign.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
used to
Right.
have home sign with my grandparents. My grandma had home signs with me, so I'm kind of used to seeing that. Yeah, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for me to adjust and pick it up, but I can get it. I think it's just within me. It's my
Mm-hmm.
experience growing up. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's what I bring to the table. Hearing interpreters have their own expertise, working with other hearing people in English, and they can interact. But the connection between a deaf person and a deaf interpreter
Right.
is champ,
Right.
and it's super important to have DIs.
So you do you have any advice for hearing interpreters, working with deaf interpreters? For myself, I've only recently experienced maybe 2 times so far, and I'm looking forward to more opportunities. I want more opportunities working with deaf interpreters. But I'm wondering, how can we have a successful approach, with both of those experiences and both of those skill
Yes,
sets,
yes.
making it successful and having a powerful opportunity to have the congruency of those two experiences. So, what is your advice, to create that smoothness?
Well, my advice would be just be curious and be open. Be open to working with a deaf interpreter. Don't be afraid. Just embrace it. Discuss and learn how to work together as a team. And plus, I encourage hearing interpreters to make mistakes. I remember when I was taking training, there was two parts to the training. The first part was specifically for deaf interpreters to train together in our cohort, and
Oh,
then the second part was to invite hearing interpreters to join us that are willing to learn how to work with a deaf interpreter.
beautiful,
And so we would
wonderful.
work with them and expose them to different resources that they can take advantage of to learn. And we had that mutual understanding, and they learned how to work with the DI. Just don't be afraid. Ask questions. Ask a DA, what's the best way to work with you as a team?
Right, right,
Because our goal is to work as a team. We're not trying to replace hearing interpreters. We need
right,
hearing interpreters. Yes, it's important. So don't imagine, oh, we're trying to kick you out. We don't need you. We are better than you. No, both hearing and deaf are equal.
mm, mm.
Yes.
Again, that's such a beautiful point about equality and equal, and it's so interesting how people, can have an automatic response out of fear. And they don't realize, how quickly they're responding to something. And so we have to do, that's introspective work and figuring out, what's going on inside. And
Mm-hmm.
we have to do that
Yeah.
work. It's important. Thank you.
I noticed some seem to feel nervous or unsure or comparing themselves.
Mm,
Comparing, oh, these are my skills. Oh, I'm lousy. Oh, why did they bring a DI? Does that mean I can't do the job? Am I a lousy interpreter? It's not about that. We are there for the deaf
right.
consumer to match
Right.
their needs. That's all. We are supposed to work together to make this a successful interaction. If you want to succeed and I want to succeed, we bring both of our skills to the table
Right.
to match that
Right.
consumer.
I agree. Again, beautifully articulated. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So moving on. For uh, deaf interpreters, how do we encourage more BIPOC individuals and also encourage more BIPOC? Um, why is it important that we have BIPOC deaf interpreters? Um, with different intersectionalities. I've seen so many different signs for that
Right, this
concept of
is my sign
intersection.
intersectionality.
Thank you, thank you. So, how do we encourage more to come into the profession, and why is that important?
That's a good question. At the same time, I'm trying to challenge it because it's very complex. I mean, like we just mentioned, intersectionality itself is a complex system. There are several different types of oppression happening in layers, and I feel like I need to encourage more people to take deaf interpreter training specifically.
Okay.
For ITPs, IEPs, I don't know. It's kind of sticky. Really, for both hearing programs and deaf programs, they're the same. but hearing programs tend to take more time and be more drawn out. But deaf
Right, right,
people already have the information, they have a lot of the basic structure. The difference is that deaf interpreter training programs focus more on deaf framing, where ITPs, IEPs try to achieve so much
right.
in one program. And it's kind of challenging because in that space, and I'm not saying that their intention is to be negative, there's just a lot of things to cover,
Yes,
and there's a lot of
yes.
triggers and microaggressions that are
Right.
continually, that deaf people continually
Yes.
experience every day. And often there was this feeling of uneasiness with how the teaching, would conflict because I'm not just a deaf interpreter, but I'm also a deaf consumer too,
Right.
right? So my perspective is a little bit different with both of those overlapping. I see you teaching, and does that mean in the future you're going to be my interpreter, and will my
Right.
interpreter make errors for me or feel no, no, no? So there's a lot of triggers for deaf people to continue because I have discussed with some peers, not in the same cohort, but from like a previous cohort or a cohort after me, a different cohort of students. I've discussed with them and they've seemed like they've had the same frustrations as me, and I agree with them. And the first semester, I was talking with a group of students. They were expressing that they had cried through their programs and there have been a lot of triggers for
Yes.
them.
Yes.
And
Wow.
I remember that was my experience recently, right before I graduated. I remember, whoa, a traumatizing moment where the teacher was talking about they had a lesson plan about how we can adapt to different deaf consumers and determine their identity. For example, well, let me explain. So you know that there are different deaf identities. There's deaf, hard of hearing, late deaf, and
Right.
so on, right?
Right.
So that was in one list. And then on another list, there was English fluency skills. And then we had to determine their ASL level based on these categories. So they were saying, if a person is profoundly deaf, that means that we can probably assume that they're fluent in ASL, but their English might be lousy. They probably can't read lips. If
Mm.
you're hard of hearing, means
Mm.
maybe you can't sign, but you might be able to read lips well, or you can speak and hear better. And so there were all these different levels and varieties of um, deafness. And I was looking at this and I was like, oh, well, I'm deaf, but I'm skilled in English too. Or what if you're deaf and you can read lips? It's not standardized,
Mm.
it's not a
Right.
puzzle or a grid. There's no, you can't assume.
Right.
You just meet a deaf person and then kind of go from there. We don't have to identify them or label them. They're just a
Yes.
person.
Yes.
They are their own individual. And so that was a trigger for me. It was triggering to see these students really supporting this concept.
Yes. Wow.
Even though that cohort I had been with for 2 years, to see them still supporting this kind of oppression,
Mm.
I really encourage them to think about deaf interpreter training.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, Sorensen recently set up a new
Oh,
program
that's
to advocate.
right.
Well, it's called Deaf Academic Interpreting, and it's a
Mm.
really good program. The first part is an advocacy group for Black, Indigenous, people of color only.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
wow.
really cool. I took it at the same time I was doing my ITP, and that Deaf Interpreter Academy
Yes.
DIA. I was doing both of those programs at the same time. It was
Oh,
challenging,
wow.
but I did it. And it was good to have the support for BIPOC people. And that's where I feel that we need to set up how to provide more resources to BIPOC deaf people to encourage them because we have them out
Yes.
there. I mean,
Yes.
Sorensen has their program, there's the Deaf Interpreter Training Program, and I took both of those. ITPs, IEPs, I'm not so sure about, but if deaf people are aware of the risk of triggers, I mean, I really
Mm.
would warn them about be mentally prepared. But at the same time, it can be very challenging being the only person, the only deaf person in that program. So it depends.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
I think, yeah,
congratulations. I mean, just going through that process and going through it. Wow. Wow.
yeah, yeah.
Um, I think those are all the questions, all seven from our list. But I guess the last one that I want to ask is something that you would like to see more of support for BIPOC, and also, well, deaf BIPOC, and also the intersection of, the queer community, the deaf queer community. Um, how can we see more support for both of those communities, and the intersectionalities of those? How can we support that and encourage, becoming DIs, or just having that
I
encouraging
think it's
support?
important to have different safe spaces for these different communities where there's a foundation. If you have a strong foundation, it's easier for
Mm,
these communities to navigate with a strong foundation, right? Like Sorensen has their program, or I went through my ITP. To have the support and a strong foundation ready, prepared, makes it easier to navigate. And it makes it easier to go through and work with a hearing team. And of course, there's going to be different perspectives and different approaches, but it's important to have a foundation where I have these tools ready and all of this knowledge. And that's powerful. It helps
right,
me
right.
advocate for myself and work to make a successful interaction. And it's important to see that there are more resources. There's different programs that we should be advocating for BIPOC people and queer people. I have
Mm,
seen very few for queer people, but
mm,
we're just scratching the surface with that. I need to search where we can find more support for them because
yes.
I am not seeing that. That is something that I'm still uneasy with. I'm trying to find more information and I'm not sure
Mm,
where to find it. I haven't
yes.
had found the answer yet. I'm still trying to figure it out myself how to support the queer community. But it's nice to have different support that can view different things. I mean, on Facebook, there's different groups.
Right.
You have your interpreting group. I have a BIPOC group. And being a part of these groups, I can learn from what they're providing and what they're offering and acquire different knowledge and have interactions and create this system and network that I have connections with and
Mm,
a common support system.
right.
And it's a safe space where I feel I can express anything that I'm dealing with and get different perspectives and feedback, and they can help me they can guide me and process me through um,
Mm.
what I'm dealing with. And I would love to see that grow more.
Well, thank you so much for sharing everything. Thank you so much for your time. And I have a feeling we could be chatting all day. I have so many more questions.
Thank you so much for having me. And I like how you asked your questions. Some of them, wow, I mean, really challenged me because now, I
Yeah.
mean, I could have been talking about rainbows, but in reality, it's very complicated.
Yes. Yes.
There's debates, there's a deaf perspective, continually having to fight down barriers and look for resources. And, throughout ITPs all over the US, are there deaf people involved?
Right.
Or
Right.
even if deaf people are involved and they're teaching, fine, but are they involved in the deaf community? Are they getting
Right.
perspective and experience and stories from the deaf community? Is this happening often or a little bit? Why? And these are the questions that I have, and ITPs aren't perfect, and so it's challenging.
Yes. Yes.
But sometimes we have to advocate for ourselves to turn the perspective and be more assertive. And some people might view it
Right.
as being hostile, but no, I'm just advocating for myself. I have to
Yeah.
represent for myself. I've disagreed with professors about identity. That example I gave, I had to give my own perspective, and I was viewed as being hostile.
Ah, but it's so unfortunate.
Right. So that's it.
Wow. There's so much different perspectives, and trying to help each other understand and help each other understand. And I just love your comment about foundation. That is such an important thing for us to recognize and identify our foundations and our support groups, and navigating that space, and how we can support
Yes.
others
Yes.
too. So that's why, again, I'm so excited for these discussions that are happening. These are opportunities, like right now, like the conversation that we're having, this dialogue, is an opportunity to really share that, and have that
Right.
conversation, and share stories, and experiences. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for
Of
sharing today.
course. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And We hope to see you again, and
Yes,
thank
hope so.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.